Chicago smelled like concrete dust and copper. 3 days after Angstrom Levy's army of alternate marks had torn through downtown, the fires were out, but the smell hadn't left. Pulverized stone, scorched rebar, and underneath all of it, the specific iron smell Mark had stopped being able to separate from anything else. He'd been pulling rubble off a collapsed parking structure on Wacker Drive for 6 hours. His hands had been shredded to muscle twice in that time. They'd healed both times. He kept digging. He wasn't flying anymore. He'd stopped around hour 3, when a rescue worker asked him, quietly, if he could lift things by hand instead. The wind off his takeoffs kept destabilizing what was left of the structures around them. He'd said okay. He hadn't gone back up since. He found the woman at hour 6. She was under 11 feet of concrete and rebar and what had been the structure's second level, and he knew before he got the last slab off that she hadn't made it. Because the Gita thermal scanner the rescue team carried had stopped registering heat signatures in this section 2 hours ago and nobody had told him, which meant they'd already done the math and decided not to make him stop. He lifted the slab anyway. He set it down without breaking it further. He looked at her for a long moment. Work clothes, a Gita contractor badge still clipped to her jacket. Somebody's coworker, somebody's daughter or wife or mother, and then he knelt and gathered her as carefully as he would have gathered something alive, and carried her to the recovery tent at the edge of the site. Nobody said anything to him. He turned and went back to the rubble. His hands were shaking. Not from exhaustion. Viltrumite muscle didn't fatigue the way human muscle did, not at the rate he'd been working. They shook because some part of him kept running the same loop underneath everything else. This happened because of me. Some version of me did this. I wasn't enough to stop it before it started. He picked up the next slab. The sound that announced Conquest wasn't a sound at all. Not at first. It was an absence. The rescue workers around Mark went quiet in a ragged, staggered way, like a wave of people noticing the same thing half a second apart and not having the vocabulary for it. Mark turned. Conquest was standing in the middle of Wacker Drive, in the space where a collapsed bus had been cleared an hour earlier, and he hadn't so much landed as simply arrived. No crater. No displaced dust. None of the violence Mark associated with a Viltrumite touching down. He stood with the total stillness of something that didn't need to perform threat. A scar ran pale and matter-of-fact across one eye. The kind of mark that had stopped being a wound a long time ago and become part of the architecture of his face. One arm, from the elbow down, was sheathed in bronze gold plating that didn't belong to flesh. Small amethyst lights along the forearm pulsed in a slow rhythm that had nothing to do with effort. He looked at the wreckage. He looked at the tent. He looked, finally, at Mark. "Grayson," he said. His voice carried without being raised. "You're not flying." Mark set down the slab he was holding. "Didn't think you'd care about my technique." "I don't." Conquest's gaze moved across the site. The rubble, the recovery operation, the slow inefficiency of human beings digging out human beings by hand. "I'm assessing whether the report I received was accurate." "What report?" "That Earth's primary asset has spent 3 days performing manual labor instead of governing." He said it the way he said everything, flat, unhurried, a man reading a status update. "Your father was sent here to weaken this planet for what comes next. You were meant to continue that work in his absence. Instead, you've spent the aftermath of an extinction-level event moving concrete." Something cold settled into Mark's chest. "Is that what this is? You're here to finish what my dad couldn't. I'm here to assess whether you failed your function." Conquest's organic eye held on him, unblinking. "Based on what I'm seeing, the assessment is straightforward. You haven't prepared this planet for anything. You haven't consolidated authority over it. You spent the worst security failure in this city's history, pulling bodies out of a parking structure, instead of asking why your fellow heroes, your alternate selves, were able to do this in the first place. They weren't my fellow heroes. They were me, from worlds where I made worse choices. And the lesson you've taken from watching versions of yourself level a city, Conquest said, is to dig through the wreckage by hand. Mark didn't answer that. There wasn't one that didn't sound exactly as small as he felt. Conquest moved toward the recovery tent. He didn't fly. He walked, the way a man walked through a building he owned, and Mark found himself stepping into the path before he'd decided to. I'm not going to let you touch them. I have no interest in the dead. Conquest stopped 6 feet away, close enough that Mark could see the careful engineering of the cybernetic arm, every joint visible, every plate fitted with the kind of attention a man gave a weapon he intended to keep using. I have an interest in determining whether you're salvageable. Salvageable for what? The only function you've ever had on this planet. His voice didn't change register. You're half Viltrumite. Your physiology will eventually exceed every threat this world is likely to face. Every threat except the Empire itself, and possibly that too, given time. What you currently are instead is a child who flinches at the responsibility of his own strength and spends his recovery time on tasks any human with a forklift could manage. A body bag, small, was carried past on a stretcher by 2 workers, a child's frame under the black material. Conquest watched Mark's face while it happened, not with cruelty exactly, but something colder. Something that catalogued Mark's expression like data rather than grief. There, he said, almost to himself. That's the thing that keeps happening, every time. As long as you stay what you currently are. You think I don't know that? Mark's voice cracked, the first crack in 3 days of holding himself together by main force. You think I haven't been standing here for 6 hours thinking about exactly that? I think you've been standing here feeling it, Conquest said. Feeling isn't the same as solving it. The silence stretched long enough that the ambient noise of the site filled it back in, generators, the scrape of debris, a search and rescue dog barking twice somewhere distant and going quiet. Conquest let it stretch. He wasn't a man in a hurry to fill silence with reassurance. Here are your options, Grayson, and I'll only state them once, he said finally. 1. I level whatever's still standing in this city tonight, on the reasoning that a population this poorly defended is a liability either way, and that ending the inefficiency now is kinder than letting it drag out. 2. You submit to my instruction. I'll make you strong enough, in body and in temperament, that nothing like this week happens on your watch again. Not because I care what happens to these insects. He tilted his head fractionally toward the tent. Because what you currently are is an embarrassment to what you could be. And I find that more objectionable than I find your planet's survival irrelevant. That's not a choice. That's a threat with a coat of paint on it. It's an honest offer. I'm not pretending my motives are generous. I'm telling you precisely what I want, and precisely what I'll do if you refuse it. Most things on this planet lie to you about what they want. I won't. Mark looked past him, at the tent, at the 2 body bags now visible through the open flap, at the cleared rubble and the sections still uncleared, at 6 hours of digging that had pulled 1 person out alive and 4 out dead, and how that ratio had held all day. He thought about Angstrom's army, about a version of himself with his own face, doing this to a city that wasn't prepared for 1 Invincible going wrong, let alone dozens. I wasn't strong enough, not just in my arms. Everywhere, people died because I wasn't ready, and the next thing that comes for this planet isn't going to wait for me to grieve first. If I do this, Mark said, and it turns out you're lying, about any of it, I'll end you. I don't care what it costs me. Something that might have been approval moved behind Conquest's organic eye. It didn't reach the rest of his face. Acceptable, he said. Most students arrive with less conviction than that. Mark looked at the tent one more time, at the city he hadn't been strong enough to save. Fine, he said. Train me. Conquest didn't smile. He turned, already walking toward open sky, already finished with the conversation now that it had resolved in his favor. "We leave in 10 minutes," he said. "Say whatever you need to say to whoever needs to hear it. After tonight, you won't be coming back as the thing you are right now." Mark stood in the wreckage of Whacker Drive and watched him go, and didn't, in that moment, understand that Conquest had just told him the truth. The site Conquest had chosen had no name that mattered to anyone, a stretch of the moon's far side, the half that never turns to face Earth, scraped down to bedrock generations ago by some forgotten survey team, and never touched since. No telescopes pointed here, because nothing on Earth ever needed to look at ground that never looked back. No Gita satellite watched it either, because every Gita satellite in lunar orbit had been built to watch the half of the moon that actually faced home. No witnesses, Conquest had said, when Mark asked why here. No structures to spare, no soft ground to absorb an impact and lie about how hard it actually landed. Mark stood on the gray rock in a containment suit Cecil's people had no idea he was wearing, and watched Conquest remove his own jacket and fold it with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. "You won't need that," Conquest said, nodding at the suit. "Vacuum doesn't kill you fast enough to matter, but take it off. I want to see what's happening to your body, not what's happening to the suit." Mark took it off. The cold hit immediately, not painful, just absolute, a temperature with no interest in negotiating. He stood on dead rock under a black, star-filled sky with no atmosphere to carry sound, and Conquest's voice arrived anyway, through a small comm clipped behind his ear, flat and close, like Conquest was standing inside his skull instead of 8 feet away. "First lesson," Conquest said. "Pain is information. Nothing more. The part of you that wants to protect itself from that information, to curl around it, to stop, to ask for a moment, that's the same part of you that watched Angstrom's army and didn't know what to do with what it was seeing until people were already dead. That's not," Conquest hit him. There was no wind-up. One moment Conquest was 8 feet away mid-sentence. The next his fist had crossed the distance and connected with Mark's sternum hard enough that Mark heard his own ribs go before he felt them. A series of dry cracks swallowed instantly by vacuum, and then he was 40 feet away, skidding across regolith that sprayed up around him in slow, gravity-light arcs. He came to a stop. He lay there. His chest was a sheet of white fire. He looked up at the black sky and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with thought, that he had never been hit like that. Not by Omni-Man, not by anything. "Get up," Conquest said in his ear, unbothered, as if commenting on weather. "I think you broke. I know precisely what I broke." "Get up!" Mark got up. It took longer than he wanted. His body wanted the floor, wanted stillness, and he made himself ignore it, and found himself standing, swaying, his chest already, beginning to knit itself back together in 1,000 small wrong notes, resolving slowly into a chord. "That instinct," Conquest said, walking toward him at the same unhurried pace as always. "The one that told you to stay down. Examine it. It's called pain. Conquest, people react to pain. Humans react to pain. You are not entirely human." He stopped close enough that Mark could see the small, constant pulse of the amethyst lights along the cybernetic arm. "Your body has already repaired the worst of what I did. Your mind is still acting like it hasn't. That gap between what your body can absorb and what your mind believes it can survive is the only thing standing between you and what you actually are." He hit Mark again, lower, into the stomach. Something ruptured. The crater Mark made on landing was visible even in the dim starlight, a long gouge through pulverized rock. "Stay down as long as you need to," Conquest said, and something in his voice shifted. Not gentler, never gentler, but more deliberate. "I'm not going anywhere. Consider what you're feeling. The part of you that wants to weep right now, that wants someone to hold you and tell you this is unfair. That's the same part that froze half a second too long against Angstrom's army. The same part that let a woman die under 11 feet of concrete because digging felt more useful than asking why the building fell in the first place. Mark lay in the crater and felt the ruptured organ pulling itself back together, faster now than the first time. He felt something else, too, a small, cold clarity opening beneath the agony, like a window cracking in a wall he hadn't known was there. "That's not fair," he said into the silence. "I didn't choose for that woman to die." "No," Conquest agreed. "You chose afterward to feel guilty about it instead of becoming someone it couldn't happen to again. Those are different choices. Only one of them helps anyone." It went on for hours that didn't feel like hours, because the sun hung too low and too slow to track, and there was no fatigue to mark time the way fatigue marked it on Earth. Conquest hit him. Mark broke. Mark healed. Conquest hit him again, in a new place, with the same flat absence of malice, the way a man tests the integrity of a bridge he intends to use for a long time. Mark learned to read the half-second of preparation that existed even in someone who didn't telegraph. By the 11th or 12th strike, he'd learned to angle his body so impact dispersed across muscle instead of concentrating in bone. He learned the healing came faster, meaningfully faster, an hour in versus the first 40 minutes. When he stopped fighting the pain and let his body do the work without his mind standing in the doorway, flinching, Conquest narrated all of it in the same clinical cadence, whether he was breaking Mark's arm or noting the recovery rate. "Empathy," he said, somewhere around hour 5, while Mark's collarbone reassembled itself under the skin in real time, "is a nervous system mistaking someone else's pain for a threat to itself. It served your species once, coordination, group survival. It serves none for you. You'll never need another person to survive anything. All empathy does for you now is slow your hand when speed is the only thing that saves a life. That's not what it's for." "Then explain Chicago," Conquest said. "Explain why someone capable of stopping a falling building chose instead to spend 3 days moving rubble by hand, performing grief instead of preventing the next catastrophe. Explain how that serves anyone." Mark didn't have an answer that survived contact with the question. Conquest hit him again. Somewhere past the halfway point, there was no clock to mark it by. Only the accumulating wreckage of the ground around them. The lesson changed shape. Conquest stopped striking and started throwing objects instead, loose boulders torn from the ridge wall, fist-sized at first, then larger, arcing toward Mark's head and chest in quick, irregular succession. "Catch them," he said. "Don't crush them. A boulder isn't a threat. Treat it like one, and you'll never be trusted around anything fragile again." The first 3 shattered in Mark's hands on contact, pulverized by reflexes that had spent the last several hours learning only one setting. Conquest didn't comment. He simply threw the 4th. By the 20th, Mark had found something in between. A give in his grip that absorbed a boulder's momentum without crushing the rock that carried it. It was the same control, he realized partway through, that flight required, and he'd never actually had to think about it before, because flight had always just been something his body did rather than something he'd had to learn to moderate on purpose. "This is the part you'll forget you needed," Conquest said, watching him catch a boulder the size of a refrigerator without so much as cracking its surface. "Anyone can learn to hit harder. Hitting harder is the easy half of strength. The other half is knowing exactly how much force a situation actually requires, and stopping there, every time, even when everything in you wants to keep going. Without that half, you're not stronger than you were on Whacker Drive. You're just more dangerous to the people standing near you when you lose your temper." Mark caught the next one without looking at it, his attention already on Conquest's hands instead, watching for the half-second of wind-up that gave away which direction the next throw would come from. "That's the part I actually believe," Mark said. surprising himself with how true it felt the moment he said it. Not the rest of it. Not yet. But that part. Conquest didn't answer. He simply threw the next boulder harder and said nothing when Mark caught that one clean too. By what Mark's internal sense of time guessed was hour 9. Conquest set him in front of a slab of bedrock he'd quarried from a nearby ridge with his bare hands, roughly the size and density of a delivery truck, and gave him a single word. Hit. Mark looked at the slab. He looked at his own hands, split open twice in the last hour, healed twice, the skin across his knuckles still carrying the faint pink shine of tissue that had regrown too recently to fully match the rest of him. He thought about the woman under the concrete, about the body bag, small, a child's frame, about Conquest's voice asking him, in 100 phrasings, the same question: what does the guilt actually do, besides slow you down? He hit the slab. It came apart in a single motion, not an explosion, nothing dramatic, just a structural failure happening all at once. The whole mass fracturing along 1,000 internal stress lines and drifting apart in slow, silent pieces across the cratered ground. Mark stood with his fists still extended, breathing hard out of habit rather than need, and waited for the thing he expected to feel. It didn't come. There was no guilt rising up behind the strike, no small voice asking whether he'd used more force than necessary. There was only the clean fact of having hit something and having it yield completely, and underneath that, a stillness he didn't recognize and didn't immediately distrust. There, Conquest said, and for the first time it carried something that might have been satisfaction. That's the beginning of it. Mark looked at his hand, at the drifting fragments, at the black sky and the absence, total, clean, almost peaceful, of the thing that had been sitting in his chest since he'd pulled that first body out of the rubble on Whacker Drive. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Somewhere behind his ribs, the place where the guilt used to live, there was nothing now but quiet. The flaxen breach opened over Detroit at 6:14 in the evening. A vertical tear in the air 4 stories tall, hanging above the intersection of Woodward and Grand River, and the first thing it did was bleed soldiers into rush-hour traffic. They came through in the loose formation of an invasion force that had done this before, 6-limbed, chitin-plated, weapons already drawn and firing before their back legs had cleared the breach. The first volley took out a city bus. The second took out a pharmacy storefront with 11 people inside. JETA satellites flagged it at 6:14 and 19 seconds. Cecil's response protocol had Invincible airborne within 90 seconds on a normal day. This was not a normal day. Mark had been back on Earth for 6 hours, his body still finishing the work of knitting itself back together after the last thing the quarry had done to it. He came down out of a clear sky at a velocity that cracked the air behind him, and the flat boom that followed him and rattled windows for 6 blocks, the last warning anyone on the ground got before he landed hard enough to throw a parked car 11 feet sideways. He didn't assess. He didn't call out a warning, didn't give the Flaxans the half-second of hesitation the old Invincible would have given anyone, human or alien, before deciding how much force a situation required. He moved. The nearest Flaxan, mid-charge, weapon raised toward a woman frozen in the pharmacy doorway, never finished raising it. Mark's hand closed around its head before the weapon cleared its torso, and the motion that followed was simply pressure, applied without hesitation, until the chitin gave the way an eggshell gives. The second turned toward the sound of the first one dying. Mark was already inside its guard. A fist through its sternum plate, not into it, through it. And it folded around the impact and stopped moving before its body finished falling. A civilian phone, held by a man crouched behind an overturned newsstand 30 feet away, caught the next 11 seconds in unsteady footage that would be played, paused, and slowed down by more news organizations over the following week than any clip in the network's history. In it Mark moves through 4 more flaxen soldiers in the time it takes the man holding the phone to say, "Oh my God," twice. No variation in technique. No attempt to disable rather than destroy. No pause, however brief, that suggests any internal debate about proportionality. When one flaxen tries to retreat back through the still open breach, Mark catches it by its rear leg and pulls it into the street and ends it there, in full view of the doorway, in full view of the phone. 6 flaxen soldiers. 51 seconds. Mark stands in the intersection afterward and looks at the bodies the way a man looks at a finished job. Not satisfaction, not horror. The flat, assessing calm of someone confirming a task is complete. He sees the phone. He doesn't move toward it, doesn't offer reassurance, doesn't do any of the small things the old Mark would have done instinctively after violence. He turns, lifts off, and is gone before the sirens arrive. The footage hit every network within the hour. By 8 p.m., it had 11 million views. By midnight, triple that, and the conversation around it had calcified into 2 camps with nothing between them. People who said Invincible had finally stopped playing games with threats that didn't deserve mercy, and people who said something behind his eyes had changed and they didn't recognize him anymore. In a newsroom in Atlanta, an anchor who'd covered Invincible's career for 6 years sat in front of a paused frame, Mark's fist mid-strike, a flaxen sternum already visibly fracturing beneath it, and found on live air that she didn't have words ready. The script assumed a tone. The tone didn't fit what was on the screen behind her. "I don't," she started, finally. "I think we need to ask some hard questions about what we just watched, and I don't have those questions ready yet. I'm sorry. We'll be right back." Cecil Stedman watched the raw satellite feed 3 times before he watched the civilian footage even once. He sat alone in the Situation Room, the lights low, a cigar unlit between 2 fingers, running the footage at quarter speed the way he reviewed every engagement involving a Viltrumite tier asset. He'd watched Omni-Man's fights this way. He'd watched the original Guardians die this way, frame by frame, looking for the moment a different decision might have changed the outcome. He found, in Mark's footage, no such moment. No decision point. No instant where a different choice had been available and rejected. From the second his boots touched pavement, the outcome had already been determined, executed with the total absence of deliberation a machine brought to a task it had been built for. His deputy, Donald, 26, 11 months into the job, still knew enough to flinch at things Cecil had stopped flinching at decades ago. Stood near the door and didn't say anything for a long time. "Sir," he managed eventually, should we issue a statement?" "Not yet." Cecil's voice was quiet. He didn't look away from the screen. "I want you to look at something." He rewound to the second flaxen, the one Mark's fist had gone through. He froze it on impact. "Look at his face. Not his hands. His face." Donald looked. Mark's expression, frozen in that half-second, showed nothing. Not rage. Not grief, restrained or otherwise. Not the particular tightness around the eyes that Cecil had learned, over years of watching this kid grow up on camera, to associate with the cost Mark always paid internally for the violence his job required. There was simply nothing. The calm, organized attention of a man checking items off a list. "That's not anger," Cecil said. "I know what his anger looks like. I've seen it. This isn't that. What is it?" Cecil set the cigar down on the console, carefully, like it had become something he needed both hands free for. "I don't know yet. But 3 days ago he was pulling bodies out of a parking garage with his bare hands and crying about it, where he thought no cameras could see him. Today he killed 6 things in under a minute and didn't blink once." He looked at Donald. "Something got inside that boy's head, and I want to know what, before it decides Detroit wasn't the last stop. Get me a line to the immortal. Not me going to him. Him. 6 miles from where the breach had opened, Eve Wilkins watched the footage on her phone, sitting on the edge of her bed with the lights off. The way you watch something you can't make yourself look away from, even though every frame costs you something. She'd tried calling Mark 4 times since 6:14. All 4 had gone to a connection that didn't even ring. Not declined, just gone. The specific dead silence of a comm channel closed on purpose. She watched the footage a 5th time. Watched the Flaxen try to retreat through the breach, watched Mark's hand close around its leg and pull it back into the open street, watched the half-second before the end where there might, in another version of this footage, in another version of Mark, have been a pause. There wasn't one. She set the phone down on the bed, screen still glowing, the paused frame casting pale light across the ceiling, and sat very still in the dark. "Where did you go?" she said, to the empty room, to no one. "What happened to you out there?" The apartment didn't answer. The screen dimmed itself to black, and she sat in the full dark that followed, and didn't turn the light back on. The Immortal found Mark at the quarry 3 days after Detroit. The same scraped stretch of the moon's far side Conquest had chosen for everything since Chicago. A location Cecil's people had no business knowing about. The Immortal had ways of getting information that didn't run through official channels. 4,000 years of accumulated favors and grudges that mattered more, in moments like this, than any agency's surveillance budget. He came alone. Cecil had wanted a tactical team standing by at range, and the Immortal had said no, flatly, in the tone of a man who'd buried enough people to know exactly when a show of force made things worse instead of better. Mark was training when he arrived, alone, no conquest in sight, working through strikes against the broken bedrock that had already taken considerable damage. He didn't stop when the Immortal's transport set down. He didn't turn around. "I know you're there," Mark said. "Cecil send you to talk me down?" "Cecil sent me," the Immortal said, climbing out, his boots settling into gray dust with the particular weight of a body built to survive almost anything. "Whether it's a talking down or something else is up to you." Mark turned. His face, in the flat starlight, showed the same thing it had shown in the Detroit footage: calm, organized. Present in a way that didn't read as wrong until you noticed what was missing. "Figured someone would come eventually," Mark said. "Figured it'd be you. Eve wouldn't have made it past the door before she started crying, and Cecil's too smart to walk into this himself. That's supposed to be an insult to one of them? It's an observation." Mark rolled his shoulder, economical, almost bored. "You're the one who doesn't have anything to lose. Can't die. Can't really be hurt in any way that sticks." Cecil sent the only person he could afford to risk. The Immortal studied him for a long moment. 4,000 years had taught him to read people the way other men read weather, the small signs before the storm, the specific stillness of air right before it breaks. He didn't like what he was reading. "I'm not here to talk you down," he said. "I'm here to find out if there's anything left to talk to." He didn't wait for a response. He moved. It wasn't a sucker punch, the Immortal didn't believe in those, but it was fast, a straight strike aimed at Mark's jaw with enough force behind it to put a normal Viltrumite tier opponent on the ground. Mark caught it. He caught it the way Conquest had taught him to, not blocking, not deflecting, simply absorbing the strike into an open palm and holding it there, the force dissipating into stillness. For a half-second the two of them stood like that, the Immortal's fist locked in Mark's hand, neither moving. "There it is," the Immortal said, something grim entering his voice. "Conquest's been busy." Mark didn't answer. He twisted the Immortal's arm and threw him. The Immortal hit the quarry wall hard enough to crack stone that had survived 4,000 years of worse, and came off it instantly, already moving back toward Mark with the particular relentlessness of something that genuinely couldn't be discouraged by pain. He'd died more times than he could count. Pain had long since stopped being an argument. He got in 2 solid strikes, ribs, jaw, and felt, both times, the wrongness of hitting something that didn't react the way a person reacted. No flinch, no retreat. Mark simply absorbed both hits and returned a third that put a fracture line through the immortal's collarbone, visible even through his shirt. "You're not even trying to pull that," the immortal said, working his jaw, tasting blood he'd stop tasting in another minute. "You're not dying," Mark said. "Why would I hold back against something that can't?" "Because that's not the point, Mark," the immortal's voice sharpened. "The point was never whether I could survive it. The point is whether you can still tell the difference." Mark hit him again before he finished the sentence. What followed was an escalation with only one direction available to it. The immortal absorbing damage that would have ended a dozen lesser threats. Getting up every time, trying through 6, 7, 8 exchanges to find some version of Mark underneath the calm, economical violence that kept answering him. He didn't find it. What he found instead, somewhere around the 7th exchange, was a thought he didn't like having, that he might actually lose this one for good. Not die. He didn't fear that, hadn't in centuries. Dying had stopped meaning much to him sometime during a war he barely remembered the name of anymore. What he feared, watching Mark's face stay flat and unbothered through strikes that should have at least registered as effort, was that the boy might keep going until there was nothing left of him to come back from, and wouldn't notice the difference between victory and accident until it was already done. He kept swinging anyway. Someone had to keep testing the wall until it either held or didn't, and he'd buried enough friends over enough centuries to know that someone willing to take the hit was sometimes the only thing standing between a bad day and an unrecoverable one. By the 10th exchange, the immortal was bleeding from 4 places that wouldn't have bled an hour into a normal fight. By the 12th, Mark caught him mid-recovery, drove a knee into his sternum hard enough to lift him off the ground, and followed it with a strike to the small of his back that put him face down in the dust with a sound that didn't belong to a body that was supposed to keep functioning. His spine had broken. He knew it the way he knew most things about his own injuries. Clinically, the specific absence of feeling below a certain point telling him exactly where the damage sat. He tried to push himself up anyway. His arms worked. Nothing below his ribs did. Mark stood over him. There was a moment, brief, almost too brief to register, but real, where something in Mark's face shifted. Not guilt, something closer to curiosity. The flat interest of a man noting a structural failure in something he'd been testing. His hand came up, already cocked, already aimed at the back of the immortal's skull, with the same precision that had ended 6 flaxen soldiers in 51 seconds. Mark, the voice that stopped him wasn't loud. That was the thing that cut through. Not volume, not desperation. Not noise his training had already taught him to discount. It was quiet, and it carried a specific, terrible steadiness that didn't match anything the situation seemed to call for. Mark's hands stopped, inches from the back of the immortal's skull. He turned. Eve was standing 20 feet away, in her flight suit, arms at her sides, not raised, not gathering the matter manipulation energy that would have meant she was preparing to fight him. She wasn't preparing to fight him. She was just standing there, and the look on her face was worse than anything a weapon could have been. Eve, Mark's voice, for the first time since the fight started, sounded almost like itself. "What are you?" Cecil told me where you'd be. Her voice was flat, not cold. The specific flatness of someone holding herself carefully together because the alternative was coming apart. "I didn't come to stop you. I don't think I can stop you. I came because I needed to see it myself instead of on a phone screen." Mark looked down at his own hand, still hovering where it had been a half second from ending a fight permanently, and lowered it slowly. "He attacked me. I was defending, don't." Her voice cracked on the syllable, the first crack in her composure, and it landed harder than any of the immortal's strikes had. "Don't explain it to me like I'm an idiot who can't see what I just watched. I watched you have his life in your hand. I watched you decide whether to take it the same way you'd decide whether to finish a sandwich. That's not fair. I know it's not fair." She stepped closer, and Mark saw for the first time that her hands were shaking, not with power gathering, just with something simpler and more human than that. "None of this is fair. Chicago wasn't fair. What Conquest's doing to you isn't fair. But I'm not talking about fair right now. I'm talking about what I just saw. And what I saw was someone I don't recognize standing over our friend with his hand raised, and the only reason he's still alive is that I happened to land in time to say your name." Mark didn't answer. Behind him, the immortal had managed to drag himself a few feet, breathing hard through the work of bones realigning in real time. "Say something," Eve said. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you would have stopped on your own." The silence that followed was the longest either of them had ever sat inside. Mark opened his mouth, closed it. He looked down at his hand again, same skin, same scars healing too fast to leave a mark, and found, when he searched for the certainty he'd had a moment ago, that it had thinned into something he couldn't hold on to. "I don't know," he said, finally. "I don't know if I would have." Eve's face didn't soften at the honesty. If anything, it closed further, the way a door closes, not slammed, just settled quietly into its frame, final in a way no amount of force could have made it. "I'm afraid of you," she said. "I never thought I'd say that to you. I'm not angry. I don't even know if I think you're wrong about everything Conquest is teaching you. But I'm afraid of you, Mark, and that's never happened before. Not even when you were learning to fly and didn't know your own strength yet. I knew you then. I don't know what's standing in front of me right now." She didn't wait for him to respond. She turned, walked back to her transport, and didn't look back once before the hatch closed behind her. Mark stood alone in the quarry, the immortal's labored breathing the only sound besides his own, and felt something shift loose inside his chest. Not the guilt Conquest had taught him to silence, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been waiting behind a locked door and had just heard the sound of a key turning. He didn't know yet what it meant. He stood there a long time before he moved. Alan the alien found the quarry by tracing a debris signature from lunar orbit, fractured rock, a crater pattern consistent with sustained Viltrumite-level combat. The signature of two bodies durable enough to exchange blows for an extended stretch without either one dying. He'd come to Earth on coalition business, routine reconnaissance ahead of growing friction with the Viltrum Empire, expecting to find Invincible doing what Invincible always did. He hadn't expected this. Training. Alone. Days after a fight with the Immortal that Gita channels were still scrambling to explain to the public as a training exercise gone wrong. He set his transport down at the edge of the quarry and found Mark mid-motion. Fast, brutal, economical, driving a combination into a section of stone that had clearly absorbed this same treatment many times before. Mark turned. Something in his face, on seeing Alan, shifted toward an expression closer to the one Alan remembered, surprised, almost glad, the ghost of the kid who used to ask him too many questions about coalition politics. "Alan, what are you doing here?" Checking in. Coalition's watching the Viltrum situation get worse. Figured I'd see how Earth's asset was holding up. Alan's eyes swept the cratered rock, the absence of anyone else. "Heard some things on the way in. Wasn't sure what I'd find. Whatever you heard, he's not going to lie to you about it," a third voice said. "I'd rather he heard the truth from someone he trusts." Conquest descended without ceremony, landing without disturbing so much as a particle of the dust around his boots. The amethyst lights along the cybernetic arm pulsed their slow, steady rhythm. His organic eye moved over Alan with a flat, assessing patience that didn't acknowledge any urgency in the alien's arrival. Alan's posture shifted immediately, weight balanced, hands loose but ready, the readiness of someone who'd fought Viltrumites before and survived only by never assuming he had the advantage. "Conquest," Alan said. "Didn't expect the welcoming committee." "You're interrupting a training session," Conquest said, "but the timing is acceptable. There are things Grayson hasn't been told, and your arrival gives me a convenient reason to finally tell him." Mark looked between them. "Tell me what?" Conquest didn't pause before answering. That, more than anything that followed, would stay with Mark afterward. The total absence of hesitation, the unbothered ease of a man who'd never once considered that what he was about to say required softening. "This was never about protecting Earth," he said. "I want to be precise, because I think you've built a story in your head about what these weeks have been, and I'd rather correct it now than let you discover the gap later when it serves me less well." "What are you talking about?" "Thragg's friction with the Coalition has been building longer than your friend here is willing to admit publicly." Conquest's gaze flicked, briefly, toward Alan. "The Empire will eventually need a weapon capable of matching whatever the Coalition fields against it. A pure-blooded Viltrumite serves that function adequately. A half-blood, raised among the species he'll eventually be deployed against, with intimate knowledge of how they think and fight, and what frightens them, that serves the function considerably better." The quarry was silent except for the faint hiss of Alan's suit regulating his breathing. "You're saying," Mark said slowly, "that this whole time, Chicago, the bargain, all of it, you were grooming me to fight for the Empire." "Yes, no qualification, no softening. I told you, the day we met, that my motives weren't generous," Conquest continued. "I told you I wanted you strong because what you currently were embarrassed me, not because I cared what happened to your planet. You agreed to my terms anyway. I haven't lied to you once since. You let me believe, I let you believe whatever conclusion you reached on your own. I never corrected it because the conclusion was useful." His organic eye held on Mark, steady, untroubled. "You needed a reason to accept what I was doing to you that didn't require examining my motives too closely. You found one. I let you keep it. That's not the same as lying." Alan stepped forward, his voice low and urgent. "Mark, he's been training you to be a weapon against my people, against the Coalition, against everyone trying to stop the Empire from doing to 100 other worlds what it tried to do to this one. I know what I'm hearing, Alan. Do you?" Alan's voice sharpened, "Because, from where I'm standing, it sounds like you've spent the last few weeks becoming exactly what Thragg needs." Conquest's expression didn't change, but something in his stance shifted, the recalibration of a man confirming an assessment he'd already made. "I'd consider whether your distress is about strategy, alien, or about losing an asset you assumed belonged to your side of the conflict. It's a fair question." Conquest turned back to Mark, dismissing Alan with the same economy he applied to everything. "Here is what I actually believe, since the truth is already on the table. I believe you were wasted on this planet. I believe the empathy your human half saddled you with would have gotten you killed eventually. Against something stronger than flaxen soldiers. Against something that wouldn't hesitate the way you used to hesitate. I have spent weeks removing that liability. I genuinely believe I've done you a service. Whether you use that strength for the Empire, for this planet, or for yourself once this is finished, that was always going to be your choice, once you were strong enough to have one. You don't get to call this a favor," Mark said. His voice was very quiet. "I'm not asking you to thank me. I'm telling you the truth, because you've earned that much by surviving this far, and because I no longer believe concealing it serves any purpose. You are strong enough now that the truth won't break you. Weeks ago, it might have." Mark looked at his own hands, at Alan, tense and ready, clearly recalculating whether this was about to become a fight he couldn't win. At Conquest, unmoved, standing in the gray dust with the same flat patience he'd worn since Whacker Drive. He thought about the slab he'd shattered without feeling anything, about the flaxen soldier he'd pulled back through the breach to finish in full view of a phone camera, about the immortal's spine breaking under his knee, his own hand cocked and ready, and the half-second where Eve's voice had been the only thing standing between him and something he wouldn't have been able to take back. About Eve's face. "I'm afraid of you." something that had been sitting coiled and quiet behind his ribs since that moment in the quarry uncoiled fully now. And didn't feel like doubt anymore. It felt like clarity arriving late to a room it should have been in from the start. "You used me," Mark said. "I used the version of you that existed before this began," Conquest said. "That version is gone. What's standing here now is something I built, and I'd argue it's worth considerably more than what I started with. To the Empire, to this planet, to yourself, depending on what you decide to do with it. The fact that my reasons weren't sentimental doesn't change the quality of the result. It changes everything," Mark said. Conquest tilted his head, the first flicker of something that might have been genuine curiosity crossing his scarred face. "Does it? Interesting. I'll be curious to see whether that survives contact with the next threat this planet throws at you." He turned to Alan, dismissing the conversation with the same total finality he applied to everything. "You'll want to report back to your coalition. Tell them Thragg's second weapon is closer to ready than they think. I find I don't particularly care how that information is received." He lifted off without another word, gone within seconds into the black sky above the quarry, and left Mark and Alan standing alone in the dust, with the truth sitting between them like a third presence neither of them knew how to address first. Alan didn't say anything for a while. He stood looking at the spot where Conquest had been, the dust still settling, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost most of its urgency, replaced by something more tired. "I don't actually know how bad it is," he admitted. "Out there. How close Thragg's people are to moving on the coalition for real instead of just posturing about it. I've been telling myself it's still years out. After what I just heard, I'm not sure I believe that anymore. Would it matter? If it's years or months? It changes what I tell Command when I get home." Alan looked at him. "It changes whether I tell them Earth's compromised and needs watching, or whether I tell them Earth just survived something most of us wouldn't have, and might be worth trusting with more instead of less." "Which one are you going to tell them?" "Honestly, I don't know yet. I want to say the second one. I watched you stand here and tell him he was wrong to his face when he could have ended you for it. That's not nothing." Alan exhaled, something almost like a laugh without any humor in it. "But I've also watched good people get rebuilt into something else before, and not all of them got the chance you just got to find out in time. I'm not finished," Mark said. "Whatever I am right now, I'm not finished becoming it. You don't have to decide today what to tell them." "No," Alan agreed. "But I do have to decide today what I believe, walking out of here. And for what it's worth, I believe you." He clasped Mark's shoulder, briefly, the closest thing to reassurance either of them had room for. "Don't make me regret that." Alan left within the hour, his transport's engines kicking up a final spray of gray dust as he lifted off toward orbit, toward a coalition rendezvous and a report that was going to land hard with people already braced for bad news from the front. He'd offered to take Mark with him, twice, the second time with the urgency of a man who suspected the offer wouldn't come a third time. And Mark had said no both times. Quiet, certain, in a voice that had started to sound like his own again somewhere in the last hour. He stayed in the quarry. He waited. The lunar day, weeks long by Earth's reckoning, had finally begun to fail, the sun crawling low enough toward the horizon that the shadows across the cratered floor had started stretching out long and sharp. The first real dimming Mark had seen since Conquest first stripped off the containment suit. Conquest came back into that fading light and found Mark sitting on a section of fractured rock instead of training, which was itself enough to register as a deviation worth noting. "You're not working," Conquest said. "No, that's a step backward. I don't think it is." Mark stood. He didn't move toward Conquest, didn't square into a fighting stance. He just looked at him, steady, level, the first time in weeks that his eyes had carried something other than flat, organized calm. "I've been thinking about what you said to Alan, about the truth not breaking me anymore. I think you might be wrong about that. I think it broke something. I just don't think it broke the thing you wanted it to." Conquest's expression didn't shift. "Explain." "You spent weeks telling me empathy was a liability," Mark said. "That it was the human part of me. And the human part of me was what got people killed. You hit me until I stopped feeling anything when I broke something. You called that strength. It is strength." "No." Mark's voice was quiet, but it carried none of the hesitation it had carried in front of the immortal. "It's the absence of something. That's not the same thing. A wall doesn't feel anything when you hit it either. Nobody calls a wall strong. They call it a wall." Something moved, briefly, behind Conquest's organic eye, not anger, something closer to recalibration. The stillness of a man encountering data that didn't fit his model. "You're attempting to insult me," he said. "I'm not attempting anything. I'm telling you what I see. The same way you've been telling me what you see for weeks." Mark took a step closer, and for the first time the distance between them didn't feel like a student approaching a teacher. It felt like two people standing at the same height. "You've been the second strongest Viltrumite alive for centuries. In all that time, has anyone ever actually known you? Not feared you. Not obeyed you. Known you, the way Eve knows me, the way the people I dug out of that rubble in Chicago knew the people who loved them. That question is irrelevant to your training." "It's not irrelevant. It's the whole answer." Mark held his gaze. "You've spent your existence being the thing people are afraid of, and somewhere along the way you decided fear and respect were the same thing, because fear was the only one you'd ever gotten. So when you found someone capable enough to actually understand what you'd built your life around, you didn't try to connect with him. You tried to break him into matching you, because matching is the only kind of company you know how to ask for." The silence stretched long enough that the dust Alan's transport had kicked up finished settling entirely. "You think I'm lonely," Conquest said finally. His voice hadn't risen. If anything, it had gone quieter, more careful. The carefulness of a man approaching a wound he hadn't expected to find exposed. "I think you're the loneliest thing I've ever met," Mark said. "And I think you've spent so long mistaking obedience for respect that you genuinely don't know the difference anymore. You called what you did to me a favor. You meant it. That's the part that actually scares me, not that you lied, but that you didn't. You really believe stripping away everything that made me capable of being known by anyone was a gift." "It was," Conquest said. "It is. You'll understand that eventually, once you've lived long enough to watch every soft thing you ever loved get used against you by something that knew exactly where to press." "Maybe," Mark's voice didn't waver, "or maybe I'll understand that the only reason you've survived this long without anyone pressing on anything is that you made sure there was nothing left to press." "That's not survival, Conquest. That's just a longer, slower way of dying alone, and calling it strength so it doesn't have to feel like what it is." Conquest moved. It wasn't a strike, not yet, but the sudden closing of distance carried the same total absence of warning that had characterized every blow he'd landed all week, and for a half-second Mark genuinely believed the conversation was about to become exactly the kind of violence Conquest had spent weeks teaching him to deliver without hesitation. It didn't. Conquest stopped a foot away, close enough that Mark could see something moving behind the scarred, flat composure of his face. Not rage, though rage would have been simpler. Something raw. The exposed stillness of a man who'd just been told an accurate thing about himself by someone he genuinely believed he was improving. "You think this is the version of you that's correct," Conquest said. "The one standing here, lecturing me about loneliness, about connection, about the things your species prizes because it lacks the strength to need anything else. You think this is clarity. I know it is. You're wrong." His voice had gone harder, the wound visible a moment ago closing back over into something Mark recognized, the same flat, methodical certainty that had broken his ribs on the first day. I gave you something this world will need, whether you accept that now or not. I gave you the capacity to act without the half-second of doubt that gets people killed. You're standing here trying to talk yourself back into that doubt, because it's familiar, because you'd rather feel guilty and useless than effective and alone. That is the human in you, reasserting itself, and it will get people killed again exactly the way it got that woman killed in Chicago. Or, Mark said, it's the only part of me that was ever actually worth keeping, and you spent weeks trying to cut it out like it was the disease instead of the cure. Conquest stepped back, just one step, but it carried weight, the first retreat, however small, Mark had seen him make. I'm going to give you 24 hours, Conquest said. For what? To reconsider what you just said to me, and decide whether you actually believe it, or whether you're simply afraid of what you've become and reaching for the nearest comfortable lie to explain it away. His organic eye held on Mark, steady, the scar across it pale in the dimming light. If, in 24 hours, you still believe what you just said, that the strength I gave you is worthless without the weakness you think makes it meaningful, then I'll consider the project a failure. And I don't leave failures standing where they can be used against me later. What does that mean? It means I will turn this planet to ash myself, Conquest said, with the same flat finality he'd used to describe Chicago's fate the day they met. Mentee or not, a weapon that talks itself out of being a weapon isn't worth the resources I've spent building it. 24 hours, Grayson. Use them well. He lifted off without waiting for a response, gone into the dark sky within seconds, and left Mark alone with the dust and a deadline that had just turned every word he'd said into something he was going to have to be ready to back up with everything he had left. Mark looked up at the empty sky for a long moment. Then he turned toward his own transport and began, for the first time in weeks, planning something that wasn't about becoming stronger. It was about going home. Mark landed at Jita Central Command well into the night, with something like 20 hours left on Conquest's clock, and walked through the front doors instead of dropping in through the roof the way he used to when he was in a hurry and didn't care about protocol. Cecil was waiting in the main situation room, alone, the lights low, a fresh cigar unlit between his fingers. The same posture he'd held watching the Detroit footage, except this time his eyes weren't fixed on a screen. They were fixed on Mark, walking through the door, and Cecil took a long moment just looking at him before he said anything. You look different, Cecil said finally. I feel different. Mark stopped a few feet inside the room. I need to talk to you. To everyone. Eve, Oliver, whoever's left who can fight. I don't have a lot of time. How much time? Conquest's going to come finish what he offered me a deal not to do in Chicago, and the clock's already running. Cecil set the cigar down without lighting it, which was, for him, the equivalent of another man going pale. Sit down. Tell me everything. Don't summarize it for my comfort. I need the real version. Mark told him. All of it. The bargain on Wacker Drive, the quarry, the slab that came apart in his hand and the nothing he'd felt afterward, the flaxen soldiers, the immortal's spine. Eve's voice being the only thing standing between him and a body he couldn't have undone. Alan's arrival. Conquest's flat, unbothered confession that none of it had ever been about Earth. That Thragg needed a second weapon, and Mark had been the raw material for building one. The 24 hours, and what happened at the end of them if Conquest decided the project had failed. Cecil listened without interrupting once, which was, in its own way, the most frightening part of the conversation. When Mark finished, Cecil was quiet for a long moment. You came back, he said. I came back. Why? Mark thought about the question before he answered, which was itself evidence of something Cecil noted and filed away. Because Eve told me she was afraid of me, And instead of feeling nothing about that, the way Conquest taught me to feel nothing about everything, I felt like the floor had come out from under me. That's the part of me he couldn't burn out. I don't think he understood it was never going to come out clean. You can't cut empathy away like a tumor. It's wired into everything else. He tried, and what he actually built was something that could go weeks without feeling anything, not something that had stopped being capable of it. Cecil studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'm going to do something I don't usually do, which is tell you everything I'm thinking while I'm thinking it, instead of managing what you get to hear. You've earned that tonight. Let's use what's left of it productively. Get me Eve. Get me Oliver. Get me whoever's still standing from the Guardians, who can walk into a room with you in it without flinching. They assembled in the Situation Room within the hour, Eve first, arms crossed, her face carefully arranged into something neutral, the specific neutrality of someone who decided, on the way over, not to feel anything until she understood what she was walking into. Oliver came next, young, but set in the particular grim seriousness he'd worn since he'd learned what his older brother's job actually cost. The immortal arrived last, his spine fully healed, moving with no visible trace of the damage Mark had done to him, except for the careful, measured way he held himself near Mark now. Not afraid, exactly, but recalibrated. Eve didn't say anything when she saw Mark. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face, and whatever she found there made some of the careful neutrality loosen, just slightly. I'm sorry, Mark said, to her specifically, before anyone else could speak. For all of it. I'm not going to pretend a few weeks of training got undone by one conversation. But I'm not the thing you saw in that quarry. I need you to know that before anything else happens tonight. I know, Eve said quietly. I can see it. That's not why I'm here, though. I'm here because you said Conquest is coming, and I want to help you stop him, not just forgive you. It was the right answer, and Mark felt something in his chest loosen that had nothing to do with anything Conquest had ever taught him about strength. Then let's get to work, Cecil said. Mark, you spent weeks getting beaten half to death by this thing at close range. Tell me everything you learned about how he fights, because I guarantee you he doesn't know we know it. Mark laid it out, drawing on a holographic display Cecil's team pulled up in real time. The cybernetic arm. It's strong, stronger than flesh and raw output. He's hit me harder with it than his organic side more than once. But it's built, not grown. The joints are mechanical. The amethyst lights along the forearm pulse when it's under load. There's a power regulation system in there managing stress the way his real arm doesn't. I think a strike concentrated exactly right, at one of the joint seams, does more damage than the same force spread across flesh and bone. You think, or you know, Cecil said. I think. I never got to test it. He never let me hit that arm directly. Always positioned to take strikes on his organic side, which tells me he already knows it's a weakness. The immortal leaned forward. What about the eye? Blind side. Right eye, same side as the arm. His peripheral awareness there is worse. Not blind exactly. His other senses compensate some, but worse. If you're coming at him from his right and staying low, he reacts slower. A half second, maybe, and hearing? Eve asked. That's the big one. Mark turned to her. He uses his inner ear for flight balance, same as every Viltrumite. High-frequency sound disrupts that. I don't know the exact threshold, but I watched him wince once. Just once. When equipment made a noise in a specific range. He covered it fast. I don't think he wanted me to see it. Cecil was already turning to a technician at the side console. Pull every high-frequency disruption asset we've got. I want portable units, field deployable. Something Eve can rig into a directional emitter if we need precision instead of a blanket effect. On it, the technician said, already moving. Cecil rubbed at his eyes, the cigar abandoned entirely now on the edge of the console. There's a version of me that wants to handle this the way I'd normally handle it. Control what the public sees, control what Thragg's people see, manage the story before it manages us. That version of me has gotten good results before. It's also the version of me that lied to you about Conquest the first time, years ago, and look how well that worked out. You lied to me after the first time he came after you. I told you he was dead. He wasn't. I had my reasons, and I'd probably make the same call again under the same pressure, but I'm telling you now before we do this, because you deserve to walk into tonight knowing exactly who's standing next to you and what he's capable of deciding without asking first. Cecil met his eyes. Tonight, I'm doing this the other way. Everything I know, you know. Everything the team decides, we decide together. You earned that the moment you walked back through that door instead of staying gone. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was as close as Cecil Stedman generally came to one, and Mark understood, hearing it, that it cost him something to say out loud. They built the plan over the next several hours, not one overwhelming assault, but a layered sequence built around the 3 weaknesses Mark had identified. Oliver, fast and easy to underestimate, would draw Conquest's attention from his blind side. The immortal would absorb the worst of his direct strikes, trading his own indestructible body for the seconds the rest of the team needed. Eve would deploy the sound emitters at precise intervals, disrupting his flight balance exactly when the team needed him grounded. And Mark would hold back from the opening exchange entirely, conserving everything. Watching for the moment the cybernetic arm was exposed and undefended. This isn't about beating him through strength, Mark said, looking around the room. He spent weeks teaching me that strength was the only thing that mattered. This is about proving he was wrong. We beat him by being smarter than he gave us credit for, by fighting like people who actually know each other instead of one thing trying to overpower another. Eve looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face came fully unguarded for the first time since she'd walked in. "That's the version of you I was looking for," she said quietly. "Welcome back." Cecil checked the clock. The light outside the windows had already gone from black to gray to the first pale wash of morning, with most of the day still ahead and the deadline still hanging somewhere past sundown. "All right," he said, standing, already moving toward the door. "Let's go set the trap." Conquest arrived as the light began to fail, exactly when he'd said he would, descending out of a sky already streaking orange and violet over the open stretch of decommissioned Gita testing ground Cecil had selected for the engagement. Flat, empty for miles, no civilians within a 100-mile radius. Every structure within the perimeter reinforced or evacuated hours earlier. He landed in the center of it without ceremony and looked around at the empty ground with the flat, assessing patience of a man confirming an expectation. "You picked a battlefield instead of waiting for me to come to you uninvited," he said, to no one visible yet. "That's the first intelligent decision anyone on this planet has made all week." Mark stepped out from behind a reinforced equipment shelter 200 yards out, alone, deliberately visible. 24 hours, Mark said. "You said I'd have time to reconsider. I did. And I still believe everything I told you in that quarry." Conquest's organic eye held on him, steady, unsurprised. "Then we're finished talking." He moved. He came at Mark fast and direct, the same opening he'd used in training a dozen times, and Mark let himself be driven back, retreating, absorbing the first strike across his forearms, falling into the role the plan required, the bait drawing Conquest's full attention forward and down, away from his blind side, away from the open ground where the rest of the team was already moving into position. Oliver hit him first. He came in low and fast from Conquest's right, a sharp combination aimed at the back of the knee that wouldn't have done meaningful damage under most circumstances, but didn't need to. It needed to register as a threat from a direction his compromised peripheral vision hadn't fully tracked. Conquest's head snapped sideways, his weight shifting to address the new angle. And in that half-second of recalibration, the immortal hit him from the opposite side with a full-force tackle that would have put a building through a wall. Conquest went down, not far, but down, and for the first time since Mark had met him, something that looked genuinely like surprise crossed his scarred face before the flat composure reasserted itself. "Coordinated," he said, getting back up with the same unhurried economy he brought to everything. "Interesting. I didn't think this planet's defenders had it in them to actually plan instead of simply reacting." "You taught me how you fight," Mark said, 20 feet away, watching, conserving. "Figured it was time you found out what we taught each other." Eve's first emitter activated when Conquest tried to take to the air. It was subtle at first, a low hum below human hearing, calibrated to the frequency band Mark had identified, deployed from a portable array Eve had rigged the night before. His ascent stuttered immediately, his trajectory wavering, the controlled grace of Viltrumite flight replaced for a half-second by something jerky and uncertain. He came back down hard, catching himself before it became a fall, but the disorientation had been real, and the immortal used it, closing the distance while Conquest's balance was still recalibrating, landing a strike across his jaw that snapped his head sideways and drew the first blood Mark had seen on him since this whole thing started. Conquest's response was immediate and brutal. He caught the immortal's next strike mid-motion and threw him bodily across the testing ground, carving a long trench through reinforced concrete before he came to a stop, already pushing himself back up, already coming back for more, with the same total persistence he'd brought to the quarry. "You can't actually hurt that one in any way that matters," Conquest said to the field in general. "I'd have thought someone here understood that immortality and durability aren't the same as a winning strategy." "He's not the strategy," Mark said. "He's the distraction." Oliver hit him again, faster, harder to track, working the blind side. Conquest turned to address him and found Eve's second emitter activating exactly as he committed his weight, disrupting his inner ear at the precise moment he needed his balance most. He stumbled. Not a fall. Conquest didn't fall. Not really. But the stumble cost him a half-second. And against 4 opponents who'd spent a night planning exactly how to use it, a half-second was an eternity. In the Situation Room 300 miles away, Cecil watched the feed in silence, Donald standing at his shoulder. Neither of them saying much as the testing ground filled with floodlit chaos on the main display. "They're not winning," Donald said, quietly, somewhere around the 30-minute mark, watching the immortal go down for the 3rd time. "They're not supposed to be winning yet," Cecil said. "Winning isn't the job right now. The job is making him spend everything he has before Mark ever steps into it himself. If the kid's plan holds, this is exactly what it's supposed to look like before it gets better." He didn't sound entirely convinced of his own reassurance, and didn't try to hide that from Donald either. Some things you didn't lie about to the people standing next to you, not when you just promised the night's other lesson was honesty. He checked the secondary readout in the corner of the screen, Eve's emitter telemetry. Cycling green to amber and back as she pushed the units harder than their specs technically allowed. "She's burning those things out faster than I'd like." "Should we pull her?" "No," Cecil's voice was flat. "If we pull her, Conquest gets his balance back permanently, and permanently is the one thing we can't afford tonight. She knows the risk. Let her make the call." On screen, Oliver went down hard, skidded, lay still for a beat too long. Cecil's hand tightened, almost imperceptibly, around the edge of the console. "Sir." "I see it." Cecil didn't look away. "He's getting up." "Watch." Oliver got up. Cecil exhaled, slow, and didn't reach for the cigar still sitting cold and unlit at his elbow. On the secondary display, the countdown he'd quietly kept running since the quarry ultimatum read just under 3 hours remaining. Not that it mattered anymore. Conquest had arrived. The deadline, for better or worse, had already resolved itself into the only shape that was ever going to matter. This fight, right now, on this ground. The fight stretched across the better part of an hour, the light dimming further with every minute. The testing ground's reinforced floodlights flickering on automatically as the natural light finally gave out. Conquest adapted. That was what made him dangerous beyond his raw strength, recalibrating his stance to compensate. Angling his body to keep the cybernetic arm shielded behind his organic side whenever Eve's emitters weren't actively disrupting him, refusing to commit fully to any single engagement long enough to be baited again. But he was also, for the first time in longer than he could probably remember, genuinely working. The immortal kept absorbing damage and getting back up. An endless, renewable cost he had no efficient answer for. Oliver kept finding angles, darting in and out, never staying in range long enough to be ended the way the Flaxen soldiers had been. And, every time Conquest reached for the air, Eve's emitters found him again, keeping him fighting on terms the team had chosen, instead of terms he'd chosen. He took a strike from the immortal directly across the cybernetic arm, close enough to a joint seam that the amethyst lights along the forearm flickered, stuttered, and a smaller plate near the elbow cracked visibly. A hairline fracture through bronze-gold housing that had never been struck that hard before. Conquest looked down at it. For the first time, something that might have been concern crossed his face. "That's new," he said, quietly, almost to himself. He turned the full force of his attention on the immortal, and the next exchange was the worst of the fight. Conquest driving strike after strike, with an intensity that hadn't been present before. The immortal went down hard. His ribcage visibly caved in, and didn't get back up immediately this time. Oliver tried to close the gap and Conquest caught him. Actually caught him. A hand closing around the boy's arm hard enough that Mark felt something in his own chest seize, and threw him 40 feet across the testing ground. Oliver hit hard, skidded, lay still for a long, terrible second before he started moving again. Slow, clearly hurt, clearly out of the fight for now. Eve's emitters kept firing, kept finding their mark, but Conquest had started fighting through the disruption now. His centuries of combat experience compensating for what his biology couldn't fully ignore, and when he turned toward her position, Mark felt the entire plan's careful architecture start to buckle under the weight of a being who simply refused to stop adapting. "Enough of this," Conquest said, and for the first time his voice carried something that wasn't flat assessment, something closer to genuine, cold anger. "You built a clever trap, Grayson. I'll grant you that much. But clever traps still require the people inside them to be strong enough to finish what the trap started." He moved toward Eve's position. Mark moved to intercept. The two of them met in the open ground between the immortal's broken, slowly healing body and Oliver's distant, struggling form, and for the first time since the fight began. It became what it had always been, underneath the strategy. Two Viltrumites, one trained by the other, standing across from each other with everything that had happened between them sitting unresolved. "They've done real damage," Mark said, looking at the cracked plating. The blood along Conquest's jaw, the unfamiliar weariness in his stance. "First time and longer than you can remember, isn't it? Someone actually making you work." Conquest's organic eye held on him, and underneath the anger, something else was there now too. Something that looked almost like respect, and almost like fear, and almost, impossibly, like a teacher recognizing for the first time that the student in front of him might actually be capable of finishing what he'd started. "Yes," Conquest said quietly. "It is." The rest of the team was down. The trap had cost everything it had to give. What remained was just the two of them. The testing ground around them had stopped being a battlefield with 4 combatants and become, in the space of a breath, a battlefield with 2. The immortal lay 40 yards back, his ribcage still knitting closed, conscious but unable to do more than watch. Oliver had pushed himself up onto one elbow, blood at his hairline, his eyes locked on his brother. Eve's emitter array sat silent and undefended 100 yards out, its hum gone quiet, because Eve herself was down on one knee beside it, a graze along her shoulder. Her hands still shaking with the effort of having kept the device running as long as she had. Conquest stood across from Mark, cracked plating visible along his forearm, blood drying along his jaw, breathing hard in a way Mark had never once seen from him in weeks of training. "They bought you this moment," Conquest said. "Spent everything they had to give you a clean shot at me. I find that almost admirable. Misguided, but admirable." "They didn't buy me anything," Mark said. "They evened the field. That's a different thing than you think it is." Conquest moved first. It was the same opening he'd used in training a dozen times, fast, direct, meant to overwhelm before a fight could find its rhythm. But Mark didn't retreat from it the way he had earlier in the evening, didn't fall back into the role of bait. He stepped into it instead, catching the strike on a forearm angled exactly the way Conquest had spent weeks teaching him to angle it, dispersing the force instead of absorbing it raw, and countered before Conquest's arm had fully retracted. The strike connected with Conquest's ribs. Conquest staggered back 2 full steps. The first time all night he'd given ground to a single blow rather than a coordinated combination, and looked down at himself with an expression that, on anyone else, would have been called surprise. "You've improved since the quarry," he said. "I learned from the best," Mark said. "That's the part you didn't account for. You taught me everything you know about how a Viltrumite fights. You didn't leave anything out, because you didn't think I'd ever turn it back on you. I considered it. Then you should have held something back." Mark closed the distance and didn't stop. Conquest shifted tactics almost immediately, the way he always did when a straightforward exchange started costing him more than it earned. "Your friends are down," he said, between strikes, his voice as level as ever even through the violence. "The girl can barely stand. The boy's ribs are likely cracked. The immortal one will heal, eventually. But eventually isn't now. If I wanted to, I could finish this fight by finishing them instead of you. Have you considered that?" It was meant to land like a blow of its own. A few weeks ago it would have. Mark felt the old reflex rise in him anyway. The cold spike of fear for people he loved, and for half a second his guard dropped exactly the width Conquest needed. Conquest's strike caught him across the temple, and the world went white and sideways for the length of a heartbeat. Mark hit the ground, rolled, came up already moving, already understanding, even through the ringing in his skull, exactly what had just happened. "That's the last lesson, isn't it?" Mark said, spitting blood, circling back into range. "Not pain. Leverage. You don't need to hurt me if you can make me hurt myself." "It's a more efficient method," Conquest agreed. "I'd hoped you wouldn't need it explained twice." "You won't get the chance to," Mark said. He didn't fall for it again. When Conquest tried the same opening a second time, a flicker toward Eve's position, a deliberate half-glance meant to pull Mark's attention off him, Mark didn't take the bait. He stayed locked on Conquest's hands, on the half-second of wind-up he'd learned to read across weeks of being hit by them. And when the real strike came, he was already moving to meet it, instead of flinching from the feint. What followed was nothing like the training on the quarry floor, and nothing like the coordinated strategy of the night's earlier hours. It was faster than either. 2 beings who knew exactly how the other moved, exactly where the other's weight shifted before a strike, trading blows at a pace that turned the open testing ground into a blur of displaced concrete and shockwaves that rattled equipment shelters half a mile out. Conquest fought the way he always fought. Flat, methodical, every strike calculated for maximum structural damage. The accumulated economy of centuries of combat compressed into every movement. He hit Mark with a combination that would have ended the fight against anyone else on the planet. 4 strikes landing in under 2 seconds, each one finding a gap his own training had taught Mark not to leave. Mark felt his jaw fracture, felt a rib go, felt the specific white-edged pain he knew now from weeks of careful, deliberate cruelty designed to teach him exactly this. And for the first time since the slab had come apart in his hand on the quarry floor, he let himself actually feel it instead of filing it away as information to be processed later. It didn't slow him down. That was the thing Conquest hadn't accounted for, that feeling the pain and being stopped by it were not, in fact, the same thing. Mark had spent weeks being taught that the only way to fight without hesitation was to fight without feeling anything at all. He'd learned, in the quarry with the immortal's spine under his knee, in Eve's voice cutting through the silence, in the long, honest conversation with Conquest the night before this fight, that there was another way. That you could feel everything, the cost, the weight, the specific human horror of what violence actually did to a body, and act anyway, clearly, deliberately, present for every second of it instead of absent from all of it. He swung through the pain instead of around it. His next strike caught Conquest across the cybernetic arm, not a glancing blow this time, but a direct hit, aimed with the precision of weeks of careful observation, landing exactly on the joint seam near the elbow, where the hairline fracture from the immortal's earlier strike had already compromised the housing. The arm didn't just crack this time, it shattered. Bronze gold plating sheared away in pieces, the amethyst lights along the forearm flickering once, violently, before going dark. Exposed wiring and mechanical structure visible underneath the broken casing, where a prosthetic that had clearly never failed this way before had just failed completely. Conquest's organic arm shot out reflexively to grab at the ruined limb, and in the half-second of his attention split between the pain and the damage, Mark hit him again. This strike landed square in the chest, full force, every fraction of strength Mark had built over weeks of being broken and rebuilt and broken again, and Conquest went down, not staggered, but down, his body carving a long trench through the reinforced ground before coming to rest in a crater of his own making. The ruined arm sparking faintly where exposed wiring caught against broken plating. He didn't get up immediately. Mark stood over him, breathing hard, his jaw still fractured, his ribs still grinding wrong with every breath, and felt, for the first time in longer than he wanted to count, exactly how much everything hurt. He didn't push it away. He stood in it. He let himself feel the full specific cost of what he'd just done, and, underneath the pain, found something that hadn't been there on the quarry floor when the slab had come apart and left him feeling nothing at all. He felt sorry. Not for hitting Conquest, the strike had been necessary, and some part of him understood that nothing less would have ended it. He felt sorry, instead, for what Conquest actually was. The loneliest, most dangerous thing he'd ever met. Lying in a crater with a ruined arm and a face that, for the first time since they'd met, showed something other than flat, unbothered certainty. Conquest looked up at him. His organic eye, usually so steady, carried something raw in it now. Not fear, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The disorientation of a man whose entire model of the universe had just been proven incomplete by the one project he'd been certain would confirm it. "You're still feeling it," Conquest said, quietly, almost wondering. "All of it. The pain. What you just did to me. You haven't gone anywhere behind your eyes the way you did with the Flaxens." "No," Mark said. "I'm right here, the whole time. That's the part you never figured out, even after everything you taught me. You don't get stronger by leaving. You get stronger by staying, even when it costs you everything to stay." Conquest didn't answer. He lay in the crater, his ruined arms sparking faintly, his breath coming hard, and looked up at the boy he'd spent weeks trying to break into something else, and found, in the space where triumph should have lived if his lesson had taken, only the quiet, devastating proof that it hadn't. Conquest lay in the crater he'd made, the floodlights catching the sparking, ruined wreckage of his cybernetic arm, and looked up at Mark standing over him with the specific stillness of a man who'd run out of moves and was waiting to find out what that cost him. Mark's hand was still raised, not cocked for a strike, just raised, the position it had settled into when the fight ended, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Behind them, the testing ground was a landscape of fractured concrete and scorched earth. The immortal pushing himself slowly to his feet 100 yards back, Oliver sitting up fully now, one hand pressed to his bleeding hairline, Eve standing beside her silent emitter array, watching. "Finish it," Conquest said. His voice carried no fear. It carried something closer to expectation, the flat, unbothered certainty of a man who'd spent his whole existence believing that strength, when it finally won, always finished what it started. "You've earned the right. I would." Mark looked at him for a long moment. Then he lowered his hand. "No," Mark said. Conquest's organic eye narrowed, the first crack of genuine confusion Mark had seen on his face since Whacker Drive. "Explain, if I kill you right now, lying here, beaten, with no arm and nothing left to fight back with," Mark crouched down, bringing himself level with Conquest's gaze instead of standing over him. "That proves everything you ever told me. That strength is the only language. That mercy is just weakness wearing a nicer word. I'm not going to hand you that, even now. Especially not now. You think this is mercy. I know it is. I also know you don't have a category for it that isn't liability, which is exactly the problem." Mark held his gaze. "Steady, you spent weeks trying to convince me that the only way to be strong was to stop feeling anything. I just beat you while feeling everything. That's not the version of strength you were teaching. It's a better one. And the only way I get to prove that's true is by not becoming you the second I win." Conquest stared at him. Something moved behind the scarred, weathered surface of his face. Not gratitude. Not yet. Something Mark suspected Conquest didn't have language for after centuries without needing it. Something closer to genuine, disoriented humiliation. The shame of a man who'd spent his whole existence believing that being spared was worse than being killed, and was now discovering, lying broken in a crater on a planet he'd come to destroy, that he didn't actually know if that was true anymore. "You're going to regret this," Conquest said, finally, but the words carried none of their usual conviction. "Maybe," Mark said. "I'll live with that. You should think about whether you can live with this instead." Conquest didn't answer. He pushed himself upright, slowly, his ruined arm hanging useless and sparking at his side, his organic hand pressed briefly against the crater's broken edge for support, before he found his footing without help. He stood, swaying slightly, and looked around the testing ground, at the immortal, upright now, watching him with old, wary eyes. At Oliver, bloodied but conscious. At Eve, her face carrying no triumph, only a quiet, exhausted relief. At Mark, last of all, standing in the wreckage of a fight that had cost both of them everything they had. "I'll be reporting this to the Grand Regent," Conquest said. "A failed asset, a wasted deployment." He looked down at the sparking ruin where his arm used to function. "Thragg does not respond well to failure. That's your problem to carry," Mark said. "Not mine anymore." Conquest looked at him for one more long moment. Then, without ceremony, he lifted off, unsteady at first, his flight mechanism clearly compensating for damage Mark couldn't fully assess from the ground, then steadier, climbing into the dark sky and shrinking into a point of light that vanished, away from Earth. Away from the planet he'd come to either weaponize or destroy, and was leaving, finally, having done neither. Mark watched him go until he couldn't see him anymore. Then his legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the cratered dirt and let himself feel, all at once, everything he'd been holding through the entire fight. Eve reached him first. She crossed the distance between them at a dead run. And when she dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands found his face before either of them said anything. Careful, urgent, checking the fractured jaw, the split skin along his cheekbone, looking for the boy she'd known underneath the bruising and finding him there, present, looking back at her with eyes that held everything they'd ever held before. "You're really here," she said, her voice cracked on it. "You came back. All the way back." "I never left," Mark said. "I just forgot, for a while, that I didn't have to leave to survive what he was doing to me." He reached up, wincing, and covered her hand with his own. "I'm sorry. For the quarry. For what I almost did to the immortal. For making you afraid of me, even for a few days. I don't have a clean way to apologize for that. I just have this. Being here, being myself, and trying to make it count for something." "It counts," Eve said. "It counts for everything." The immortal limped up beside them, his ribcage fully healed, his collarbone set, the specific resilience that made him who he was already erasing the worst of what the night had cost him. He looked down at Mark for a long moment, then extended a hand. Mark took it. The immortal pulled him to his feet. "You hit harder than Conquest does," the immortal said. "I want that on the record, in case anyone ever asks me to compare. Sorry about the spine. Don't be. You stopped." His grip tightened briefly before he let go. That's the only part that ever mattered. Oliver reached them last, favoring one leg slightly, the blood at his hairline already drying, and Mark crouched down to meet him at eye level the way he always had, ever since Oliver was old enough to need someone who actually looked at him instead of down at him. "You okay?" Mark asked. "I'm okay." Oliver looked at him, at the fading bruises already beginning the work of healing across his brother's face, and something in his young, serious expression loosened, just slightly. "You scared me. Before, when Alan told me what was happening up there, what you'd become, I didn't know if you were coming back." "I know," Mark said. "I'm sorry you had to find that out before I figured it out myself. Are you going to be okay? For real?" Mark thought about the question honestly before he answered, the way he'd been trying to do with everything since the quarry, since the moment he'd realized the difference between feeling nothing and feeling everything, and choosing to act anyway. "I don't think okay is the right word for a while," he said. "I think I'm going to carry what happened this week for a long time. But I'm not going to carry it the way Conquest wanted me to carry it. Buried, cut out, pretended away. I'm going to carry it the way it actually happened, and let it make me better instead of letting it make me empty." He put a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "That's the only kind of okay that actually lasts." Oliver nodded, slowly, the particular gravity of someone much younger than the things he'd already had to understand. "Good," he said, "because I need my brother. Not whatever that other thing almost was." "You've got him," Mark said. "All the way through." Cecil arrived a short while later, his transport setting down at the edge of the testing ground, and walked out across the cratered, broken earth, with the particular weariness of a man who'd spent the entire stretch since midnight running command from 300 miles away, watching everything unfold on a feed and unable to do anything but trust the plan he'd helped build. He took in the scene, the four of them, battered, bloodied, standing together in the wreckage of a fight that had nearly cost everything, and something in his perpetually guarded face loosened into an expression close to relief. "He's gone," Cecil said. "It wasn't a question. He's gone," Mark confirmed. "Reporting back to Thragg. A failed deployment. And you didn't finish him." No, Cecil studied him for a long moment, the same assessing study he'd given Mark's father for years before that, the study of a man who'd learned, over decades, to read the difference between strength and the performance of it. "Good," Cecil said. "Finally, I was worried, watching the feed, that you'd come out the other side of this still half him. Glad to see I was wrong." "You weren't entirely wrong," Mark said. "Some of what he taught me, I'm keeping. The way he fights, the way he reads an opponent, the things he knew about what my own body can actually do that I never tested before this. All of that's mine now, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't useful. I'm just not keeping the part where none of it was supposed to mean anything to me." Cecil nodded slowly. "That sounds like the difference that actually matters." 3 systems away, close enough to the front that the static on Coalition channels never fully cleared, far enough that news still arrived a day late, Alan the alien stood in a briefing chamber on a Coalition cruiser and watched a dozen alien faces absorb what he'd just told them. "Say it again," said the officer at the head of the table, a Taliscrian with skin like hammered pewter. "Plainly, no softening it for us." "Conquest came to Earth to finish converting their asset into a weapon for the Empire," Alan said. "He nearly succeeded. The boy pulled himself back from it at the last possible moment, with help, and then beat Conquest badly enough to send him home crippled. But the fact that it got that close should worry every one of us more than the fact that it didn't finish that way. Then, Earth's asset is compromised. Earth's asset is 19 years old and just found out his own government's chief military partner has been hiding pieces of his own history from him for years," Alan said. "He's not compromised. He's exhausted. There's a difference, and I'd ask you to remember it, because we're going to need him steady for what's coming, not afraid of him." The Telescrian studied Alan for a long moment, the way Command always studied the people who brought them news they didn't want. "And if Thragg sends something stronger than Conquest next time, then we'd better make sure Earth isn't standing alone when he does," Alan said. "That's not a comfort. That's a request." Nobody answered that directly. But nobody dismissed it either, and Alan left the chamber knowing that was as much as he was going to get today, and that it would have to be enough. In the weeks that followed, Chicago finished its long, grinding work of rebuilding, block by block, the same way it had been rebuilding since before Conquest had ever landed on Wacker Drive. Mark went back to the rubble sites, not alone this time, not pulling concrete by hand in silent, hollowed-out grief, but with Eve beside him, with the Jita's full recovery infrastructure finally caught up to the scale of what the city needed, doing the work of an actual protector instead of a man trying to atone for a failure that had never really been his to carry alone. He learned the names of the construction crew leads. He learned which corner store had reopened first and started buying his coffee there on purpose, a small, deliberate kindness that cost him nothing, and meant, he suspected, more to the owner than either of them said out loud. He stopped flying directly to emergencies and started landing a block out and walking the last stretch when there was time for it, because he'd noticed, somewhere in the last few weeks, that people flinched less from a man walking toward them than from one falling out of the sky. Alan's report reached Coalition Command within days, and the response that came back was cautious, watchful, an acknowledgement that Earth's primary asset had been compromised once and might be again, that the Empire's reach into the planet's defenses ran deeper than anyone had fully accounted for. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was the beginning of a conversation about what came next, about the larger conflict with Thragg that was still coming whether Earth was ready for it or not. And Mark found himself, for the first time, approaching that conversation not as someone broken into a weapon, but as someone who had survived being broken and chosen, deliberately, who to be on the other side of it. He visited the Immortals training facility once a week now, not to be hit until he stopped feeling, but to spar, to learn, to build something that looked like the discipline Conquest had tried to force into him without any of the cruelty that had defined it. The sessions were shorter. They ended in conversation instead of silence. The Immortal, for his part, never brought up the spine, never asked for an apology beyond the one Mark had already given. He simply showed up, every week, ready to fight someone he trusted again, and somewhere around the 4th or 5th week he started bringing 2 coffees instead of 1, setting the second down on the equipment rack without comment, like it had always been part of the routine. Oliver took to following Mark around the rebuilt annex on the afternoons he wasn't in school, asking sharper questions than an 11-year-old should have had ready, about the Coalition, about Thragg, about what it had actually felt like. The week his brother had stopped being able to recognize his own reflection. Mark answered all of them honestly, even the ones that cost him something to answer, because he'd decided somewhere in that crater that honesty, even the expensive kind, was the only currency that had ever actually worked between the two of them. Eve stayed close. Closer than she'd been before Chicago, before the quarry, before any of it. Not because the fear had vanished entirely, Mark suspected it never fully would, but because she'd watched him choose, at the one moment it would have been easiest not to. To stay present instead of disappearing into the version of himself that frightened her. That choice had told her something the words alone never could have. On a clear evening 3 weeks after Conquest's retreat, Mark stood on the roof of the rebuilt Jeddah Chicago annex with Eve beside him, watching the city's lights come up against the dusk, and felt, for the first time since Whacker Drive, something that wasn't guilt and wasn't the cold, organized absence Conquest had taught him to mistake for peace. It was simply quiet, earned, ordinary quiet, the kind that came after surviving something rather than the kind that came from refusing to feel it. "You're different," Eve said, watching him, "than before all this. Not the bad different. Just different. I think I had to break. A little," Mark said. "To understand what was actually worth holding on to on the other side. Conquest thought breaking me meant emptying me out. He was half right. He just got the half backward. It wasn't the empathy that needed to go. It was the part of me that thought feeling things and being strong enough to act on them were two different jobs." Eve leaned into his shoulder, and he let her, the scars across his face and ribs still healing, the memory of a week he'd never be able to fully set down, still sitting somewhere behind his ribs, where the guilt used to live before Conquest had tried to carve it out. It hadn't come back the way it left. It had come back changed, quieter, steadier, no longer a wound he carried alone in silence. But something he carried in the open now, beside people who knew exactly what it had cost him, and stayed anyway. Below them, Chicago kept rebuilding, one block, one storefront, one family at a time. Above them, the sky stayed clear, holding no threat for the moment. No deadline, no ultimatum waiting at the end of 24 hours. Mark stood there, present for all of it, and didn't look away from any of it, and understood, finally, that this, not the strength Conquest had tried to build, but the strength he'd found on the other side of refusing it, was the only kind worth having. Somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, in the dark between Earth and wherever Conquest had crawled off to lick the wound of a failure he'd never have to explain to anyone who'd believe him, a different kind of clock had already started running. The one counting down to whatever Thragg decided to send next, now that the first weapon had come back broken and unconvinced. Mark didn't know that clock's number yet. He suspected, standing on that rooftop with Eve's shoulder against his, that he wasn't supposed to. Some things you only got to face when they actually arrived, not a day before, and spending tonight bracing for them instead of living in them would have been its own kind of defeat, the quiet, patient kind Conquest had never quite managed to explain, the kind that came from refusing to let the next fight steal the only peace you'd earned from surviving the last one. So he let it go, for now. He let the city below him keep rebuilding without watching every brick. He let Eve's hand stay where it was instead of pulling away to brace for something that hadn't happened yet. He let himself, for one clear evening, simply be a man standing on a roof with someone he loved, instead of a weapon waiting to be needed. It wouldn't last forever. Nothing on this planet, or any other, ever did. But it lasted tonight, and tonight, for the first time and longer than he could measure, was enough. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.